The Vatican press hall had never felt so volatile. This was not the slow, solemn weight of incense or chanted prayer. This was anticipation, a sharpened silence wrapped around suspicion. The eyes in the room were not raised in devotion, but narrowed in scrutiny. Every camera was fixed on the lectern. Behind it, the man they once called the shepherd of the margins, now seated in the throne of Peter and accused of shaking its foundations. He had not yet spoken a word, but they were already prepared to strike. Then, unexpectedly, abruptly, a voice pierced the hush. Not from the back, where protesters sometimes roamed, but from the front row, credentialed, clean-shaven, confident. A journalist stood. No preamble, no protocol. Do you really think you can rewrite the church? He didn't shout it. He didn't need to. The arrogance was quieter than volume, but just as sharp. The cardinals flinched. A bishop lowered his eyes. A Monsignor touched the crucifix at his collar. And Pope Leo XIV? He looked up. There was no flash of irritation, no flicker of fear. Only the serene gaze. The gaze of a man who had held dying children in refugee camps, who had wept in confessionals where no cameras were allowed, who had carried the weight of tradition not as a weapon, but as a wound. He studied the young man for a long moment, not with scorn, with sadness. And then he answered, "I am not rewriting the church," he said. "I am remembering her." He did not raise his voice. He did not repeat himself. But the moment thundered through the hall like judgment. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something else. Conviction. And maybe, just maybe, conviction's first cousin, shame. Because in that instant, everyone in the room knew. This was not the day the Pope was exposed. This was the day the world was. The man standing beneath the weight of St. Peter's dome was not shaped by palace walls, nor bred in marble halls of ecclesial diplomacy. Before he was Pope Leo XIV, he was simply Father Matteo, a son of dockworkers from Palermo, whose hands had known labor long before they ever held a chalice. He had not risen through the church by ambition, but by obedience. Obedience to pain. Obedience to silence. Obedience to the spirit that does not shout, but whispers. In his 30s, he had vanished from Rome's academic circuits and reappeared in the burned-out remains of a bombed chapel in Mosul, where he lived among the hunted. He had written nothing for publication, but composed entire sermons in the dirt, drawn with the fingers of refugee children. He did not seek rank. Rank found him reluctantly. His body bore the tiredness of a man who had listened to too many deathbed confessions, and his soul bore the clarity of one who had survived every lie that power had tried to bury truth beneath. They made him cardinal because they feared him. They elected him pope because they couldn't stop him. And now he stood before the world, not robed in triumph, but clothed in grief. Grief for what the church had become, and hope, fierce and holy, for what it might still become again. Across from him, seated just a few meters away but spiritually light years apart, was Julian Marr. 38, Cambridge educated, decorated, dangerous. Julian had built his career on precision strikes. He had exposed the secret dealings of pharmaceutical cartels in Latin America, published award-winning exposés on institutional cover-ups in government and religion alike, and dismantled the reputations of men who once believed themselves untouchable. He didn't hate the church. He didn't need to. He simply believed in truth, his version of it. Measurable, provable, controlled. To Julian, Pope Leo was not a shepherd. He was a paradox. A man who spoke of justice but refused to condemn by name. A man who embraced reform but walked in silence among centuries-old rituals. A man who claimed no ideology but commanded millions of souls across political lines. Julian had studied him carefully, waited patiently, chosen his moment, and now, live on an international broadcast translated into 17 languages, he had asked the question he believed no pope could answer without unraveling. Do you really think you can rewrite the church? But the response he received, "I'm not rewriting the church. I am remembering her," did not come from a man grasping for legacy. It came from one who had already died to his ego. There were no gasps from the press row after the Pope's reply. There was no applause, only silence, Unnatural, elongated, sacred. It was the kind of silence that once preceded the thunder at Sinai. The kind that falls just before a soul decides whether to believe or to flee. What the cameras could not show, what only the Spirit could reveal, was how in that silence, something inside Julian had shifted. Not shattered, shifted. A hairline crack, invisible to the crowd, but undeniable to him. And across the world, millions watched. Some in awe, some in discomfort, some in rage. Because this was not just a media event. This was confrontation between two visions of authority. One forged in humility, one built on scrutiny. The Pope had not declared reform. Not yet. But the weight of what he represented was already shaking the walls of certainty. The stakes were more than institutional. They were eternal. If he was right, if this truly was the beginning of the Church's renewal, then every corner of the Catholic world would be touched. From cathedral to favela, from seminary to supper table. And Julian Marr knew this. That is why he asked the question, not to hear an answer, but to stop the momentum. Because momentum is dangerous when it comes from beneath, when it rises not from decrees, but from the weeping of the forgotten and the prayers of the faithful who never gave up. The camera stayed fixed. The satellite feeds didn't blink. But something deeper had begun. Something irreversible. The Vatican would never be the same. And somewhere, within the pride-swaddled confidence of Julian's stare, a question trembled. What if the old man is right? If Pope Leo speaks truth, why are so many afraid to follow? If courage in the Church still matters, not the kind printed in headlines, but the kind that bends its knees and confronts its own sin, then subscribe to Holy Shadows. If not, tell us in the comments. Tell us why you'd rather stay silent when the Church begins to speak again. Julian adjusted the small microphone clipped to his lapel. The silence still hung thick from the Pope's last reply, but he leaned into it with practiced composure. He had faced presidents, generals, and CEOs, and made each of them squirm without raising his voice. He did not need theatrics. He needed precision. So he softened his tone, not retreating, but repositioning, like a fencer switching stance. "Your Holiness," he began, smooth and reasonable. "Some say you're abandoning tradition." There it was. The first real blade, dipped in civility but sharpened by insinuation. A few reporters tilted their heads. A Vatican aide shifted a notebook. Somewhere near the back, a translator paused, unsure if the word abandoning would carry the same poison in other tongues. Pope Leo XIV smiled, but it was not amusement. It was recognition. He had heard that line before, not in press rooms, but in sacristies, in seminaries, in confessionals whispered with fear. Is change betrayal? They would ask him. Is mercy weakness? Is listening surrender? He looked at Julian, not with offense, but with the gravity of a shepherd watching a lamb mistake the cliff for the path. Then he answered. Tradition, he said gently, is not a cage. It's a vessel. The words dropped like oil on water, subtle, spreading, impossible to contain. He let them linger before he continued. A cage confines. A vessel carries. Our task is not to worship the vessel itself, but to ensure it still carries Christ. A murmur rippled. Not outrage, something quieter. A questioning. Julian nodded slowly, registering the metaphor, not yet reacting. But he had expected as much, and so he pressed forward. And what gives one man the right, he asked, to alter what millions have known for centuries? This time he didn't mask the edge. It was the ancient suspicion, resurrected again, that the Pope was overstepping. That personal conviction had become papal overreach. That the man in white was, perhaps, playing God. Again, Leo didn't bristle. Instead, he turned his face toward the crucifix hanging behind the cameras. I have no right, he said, only a responsibility. Then, with the quiet cadence of one who knew the scriptures not as texts, but as lifeblood, he continued. Our Lord overturned tables in the temple. He touched the lepers before the law allowed it. He allowed women to sit at his feet, where only disciples were welcome. He spoke of seeds that die before they bear fruit. He paused, eyes still on the cross. The Church is not changed by my voice. She's changed when we finally hear his again. That line made even Julian blink. There was no cleverness in it, no rhetorical flourish, just a dangerous, unanswerable simplicity, because it suggested something uncomfortable, that it was not the Pope who was making the church different, but the church that had drifted, and the Pope who was only swimming back upstream. Julian crossed one leg over the other, buying a few seconds of posture. He couldn't risk looking shaken. Not yet. So he reached for doctrine. Your Holiness, respectfully, doctrine cannot be shaped by circumstance. That's what gives it integrity. The Pope nodded, as if grateful for the question. Doctrine, he said, is not a fortress to be defended. It is a flame to be passed, unchanged in fire, but alive in motion. Another silence, this one deeper, because the flame had passed, and Julian felt its heat. It was not the fire of fury. It was not the fire of fame. It was the fire of conviction. And fire, when it meets dry wood, does not ask permission. Across the globe, in rectories and kitchens, in youth groups and nursing homes, people were watching. Some nodded. Some clenched their fists. Some stared at the floor. Not because they agreed, but because something had landed. Something unshakable. Pope Leo had not announced a single reform yet, but he had already redefined what tradition meant. Not as a museum of untouchables, but as the living memory of God's presence among the flawed. Julian felt it too. Not agreement, but discomfort. And discomfort, he knew from years of interrogations, was always the first signal that truth had found its mark. If truth makes the powerful uncomfortable, what does your silence mean? If you believe the church must speak even when it's hard, subscribe to Holy Shadows. But if you can't, then say so in the comments. Say what holds you back. Say it plainly. And ask yourself, is it tradition you defend or comfort? Julian had remained composed until now. Curated, deliberate, always 2 steps ahead in framing the narrative. But something in the Pope's last words, power protects itself. The gospel protects the vulnerable, had pierced the steel casing of control. He shifted forward, fingers clenched around the armrest, voice clipped and unfiltered. So where are you now? He asked louder than before. A politician in white robes. The room didn't stir. It froze. The insult, though veiled as a question, was unmistakable. And it echoed, through centuries of suspicion, through kingdoms and courts, through every era when the papacy was accused of compromise or corruption. And yet, in this moment, it did not land like a thunderclap. It hung there, suspended in its own weight, waiting for the one man who could dissolve it with silence or sanctify it with truth. Pope Leo didn't either. He responded, calmly, but with a new depth, like a subterranean current suddenly surfacing. I've stood, he said, where governments collapsed. The words fell slowly, shaped by memory. I've held children who knew no country, only hunger. I've walked through villages where the only sound was the wind moving through broken roofs. I've listened to confessions spoken through iron bars in languages I did not speak, and still, somehow, understood. His voice did not rise, but its authority deepened. I've baptized the dying in mud. I've kissed the scarred hands of women who survived men the world had stopped seeing. And I have prayed beside graves that bore no names, only crosses and hope. The journalist sat still, lips parted, no words left prepared. The room had stopped breathing. And then, the Pope delivered the line that would break the internet. You call it reckless to love the outsider, he said. I call it fidelity to Christ. The air collapsed in silence. No applause. No gasp, just the weight of something eternal. For the first time, Julian could not hide the shift in his face. Not anger, not embarrassment, but a momentary, involuntary recognition of something he had not prepared to encounter. A truth, too, lived in to refute. The screens around the world did what only sacred moments forced them to do. They stilled. Comments slowed. Notifications paused. And in millions of homes, people sat back, not out of boredom, but out of burden. They were not watching an interview anymore. They were witnessing testimony, not a man defending a system, but of a man exposing its soul. Flashbacks, unspoken, unshown, but seared into memory, flickered in the minds of those who had followed the strange, unpredictable pontificate. Pope Leo barefoot in a South Sudanese chapel, kneeling on wet ground. Pope Leo behind prison bars, not preaching but listening. Pope Leo waist-deep in floodwaters in Bangladesh, handing out food with his sleeves rolled and his crucifix tucked beneath his shirt so it would not be kissed. He had not ruled like a monarch. He had moved like a shadow, present where the world's lights went dim. Not as a ruler, but as a servant. And now, in the very halls where his every word would be dissected and spun, he had declared the thing most dangerous to institutions, that love was more powerful than approval. Julian cleared his throat, but said nothing. There was no line left to fire, no clever retort, no doctrinal trap that could contain a man who had buried the forgotten and called them sacred. In that stillness, time stretched, and the question lingered, unspoken now, but louder than ever. If that is not Catholic enough for you, what is? If this truth shakes you, not because it offends you, but because it awakens something you thought had died, then subscribe to Holy Shadows. If not, then speak your fear below. Tell us why love unsettles you. We'll wait, but understand, truth has never waited for approval. The silence held, not the kind born of respect, but the kind that followed a dismantling. Julian's composure, so carefully curated, now sat beside him like a shattered mask. He looked down briefly, perhaps seeking his next angle, but the table where his notes lay had already become irrelevant. There were no words left on the page that could cage what had just been unleashed. And Pope Leo remained still, not triumphant, not smug, but still in that ancient, uncomfortable posture of the prophets, the kind of stillness that speaks even as it listens. And then he began again, this time not in defense, but in revelation. You confuse holiness with comfort, he said, softly, gently, even. Yet nowhere in the Gospels did Christ promise comfort to the comfortable. He stepped slightly forward, not toward the journalist, but toward the world watching. You think truth must remain still, he said. But Christ walked. The room didn't breathe. He walked through Samaria, where no Jew would go. He touched the leper, when no priest dared. He broke bread with sinners, when the righteous recoiled. He bent low to wash the feet of those who would betray him. You call that rebellion. I call it holiness. No one moved. Not the press. Not the bishops. Not even the security detail whose eyes had never left him. He continued. You think doctrine is armor, he said, voice steady. But I see it as light. He turned his gaze not to Julian now, but to everyone. Armor is made to protect, but light is meant to reveal. Armor shuts out. Light invites in. The weight of his words did what argument never could. It stirred the deeper hunger, hidden beneath skepticism, buried under sarcasm, numbed by decades of scandal and silence. You demand certainty, he said quietly, but reject mystery. A pause. That is not faith. That is fear. Something shifted. Rows of press began to shift in their seats. A few looked down, others leaned in. One woman, an elderly nun in the back row, began to weep silently, rosary clenched in trembling fingers. An Italian journalist who had once written op-eds mocking the papacy slowly closed his laptop. Two cameramen exchanged glances, unsure whether to zoom in or simply let the frame linger. Then, softly from somewhere in the middle, came a sound. Applause. Tentative, but real. It did not spread like wildfire. It spread like grace, quiet, sincere, and utterly inconvenient. Another voice joined, then another. Some stood. Others remained seated, hands clenched in conflict, caught between the safety of silence and the demand of conscience. Julian sat motionless. No final question, no challenge. His armor had been doctrinal pride, but it had meant something deeper than debate. Conviction without condemnation. Truth without triumphalism. Pope Leo's final words in this section landed like a benediction and a warning all at once. You say I have made the church uncomfortable, he said. But if the church is alive, it must be uncomfortable. Because comfort never converted a soul. And Christ never once called us to stay where it was safe. He stepped back, not to retreat, but to make space, for silence, for decision, for the spirit that convicts in ways no press conference ever could. If the church is truly alive, it will not coddle you. It will confront you. Are you ready for that? Then hit subscribe to Holy Shadows, because truth should never wait for permission. And if you aren't ready, tell us below. What comfort are you still clinging to? What truth do you fear will cost you too much? The room was no longer a press forum. It had become a sanctuary, a stillness not of media restraint, but of hearts stunned open by something older than rhetoric, older even than the church. A truth not argued, but revealed. And in that silence, Pope Leo stepped back, not in withdrawal, but in invitation. He did not look at Julian. He looked beyond him, to the cameras, to the watching millions, to the aching, skeptical, longing heart of the church itself. His voice no longer carried the weight of confrontation. Now, it carried something more dangerous. Hope. This isn't about him, the Pope said gently. It never was. His hand lifted, not in command but in compassion. It's about all of us. Our fears, our comforts, our excuses, our need for someone to blame instead of someone to follow. The words settled like ashes on the shoulders of a church that had long since forgotten its fire. We must decide, he said. Not tomorrow, not when it feels safer, but now. Will we cling to fear or open the doors to grace? The camera caught the moment a bishop in the front row lowered his head, his eyes brimming. Another crossed himself with trembling hands. The Swiss guards at the edge of the frame, stoic by duty, stood just a little straighter, as if remembering who they were really guarding. And then came the unexpected. Pope Leo did not list reforms like a politician announcing policy. He named them like a shepherd calling home scattered sheep. 12. Each one spoken with reverence, with silence between them. Not explained, but entrusted. Ecological stewardship, because creation is not a possession, but a praise song. Reintegration of the divorced, because mercy has a door, and it is Christ. Consecration of Europe to the Immaculate Heart, because when a continent forgets its soul, only a mother can lead it home. Diocesan decentralization, so that bishops might become pastors again, not bureaucrats. Expanded roles for women in governance, not to mimic power, but to model grace. Pastoral provisions for those with same-sex attraction, not to affirm sin, but to never abandon souls. Liturgical renewal, not to innovate, but to remember. Transparent Vatican finances, because the bride of Christ should not wear stolen jewels. Reparation for abuse victims, monetary, yes, but spiritual above all. Mandatory confession for bishops every quarter, because authority without repentance is rot. Interfaith collaboration, without compromise, but with open arms. And a universal year of Eucharistic renewal, because we forgot the one who is already among us. He paused after each line, not